Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Tom. I was afraid you'd find a more embarrassing story than that one, since we have known each other for a while. I appreciate all of you making time on your agenda to talk a little bit about trade and how trade impacts the organic industry. I wanted to highlight a couple of different things today, and we got a great start from Monique on looking at the role of those equivalency agreements, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And sort of a vision for where those might eventually go and how they can help this industry. But then I also wanted to talk a little bit about our current trade agenda and the Trans-Pacific Partnership and how that has an opportunity to open real markets for organic agriculture, currently with 12 nations in the Asia-Pacific region, but the opportunity to expand beyond that as well. So, international trade, you just heard, is becoming an increasing part of the organic industry and the organic industry's bottom line. This has been a banner year for agriculture. I'm sure Secretary Vilsack, and I know you heard from Miles, have talked about the success of that industry. Total organic product sales, of course, this year at $4.2 billion. And hitting a new up $4.2 billion and hitting a new benchmark of $43.3 billion this year. We just heard that those equivalency arrangements make a huge contribution to that growth as well. They strengthen our ability. The equivalency agreements strengthen that ability to maintain both the integrity of the organic program while at the same time reaching new markets and expanding our product base by having access to organic inputs that we import, but also new places to send our exports from the products that we all produce. And doing so, of course, with the confidence that our organic program has certain things in common, that bedrock commitment to quality and integrity with the programs that we choose to recognize and do business. But as we look ahead, some of our key opportunities and challenges will be how do we develop a vision collectively in the U.S. and with our trading partners about how we expand those agreements, how the individual equivalency agreements might relate to one another, and that we look with all of that at an eye to, again, ensuring integrity and consistency of the programs, but also making sure that we maintain consumer confidence in how those programs operate and relate to one another. As it was just pointed out, the U.S. already has equivalency arrangements with Canada, with the European Union, Japan, Korea, and Switzerland. And they allow, of course, those of you who use that organic symbol in the U.S. can now use it in other countries as well, and the same for organic producers from those countries. We're in the process of negotiating an agreement with Mexico. I think Miles might have had the chance to talk to you a little bit about that earlier today. New Zealand, India, and Israel have recognition agreements with us to accredit their certifying bodies in their countries to certify to standards, short of equivalency, but surely a first step to allow them to export to our market. And several countries with really nascent organic sectors just starting to build that sector identity. In Chile and Peru, for example, have already expressed interest in a bilateral organic equivalency arrangement. The TPP, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for the first time ever, has an annex specifically on organics. And I think that's pretty remarkable that 12 trading partners at very different levels of development chose to put language in a trade agreement that says we should coordinate on our organic programs and think about the opportunity for equivalency arrangements that could spread throughout that region. So again, our experience is that those equivalency arrangements foster cooperation and collaboration with other countries on both technical issues, but also broader policy and commercial issues as well, that they work to strengthen our joint enforcement and oversight of these agreements across both of our markets. So we've been pleased with that progress so far. And we have used this as an opportunity, frankly, to emphasize enforcement and compliance in the other markets with whom we have established these agreements. Miles might have mentioned to you that on the forefront of our current negotiations with Mexico, we agreed on a very specific work program to ensure confidence, to have an ongoing committee that looks at compliance and enforcement issues to ensure they have a robust system in place. When you have the kind of relationship between governments that is necessary for an equivalency agreement, it allows continued attention to those efforts to be part of the built-in agenda. But I think we're sort of at a critical point, frankly, on this equivalence mission. And part of that is because we now have enough different arrangements that we're reaching what sometimes is talked about in the trade arena as sort of this spaghetti bowl of agreements. And not all of them have exactly the same standards or qualifications or things you have to do to participate. Even when we recognize each other, there are exceptions to some agreements and others. And so I think we're at a critical point to reflect a little bit on where we go from here. And how do we continue to recognize other countries, have other countries recognize us without creating a myriad of standards that make it too hard for you as perhaps as small business people to be able to actually utilize each of those markets and to meet those different standards. And so we're trying to think about this issue with other countries who are starting to have the same problem, namely the EU, who has equivalency arrangements with a number of other countries as well, to say, could we move beyond a bilateral sort of hub and spokes type of arrangement where countries have agreements with each other, to think about streamlining that and having a bit more of a cohesive operation. And we're really at the beginning of this and thinking about whether we could do sort of an organic plurilateral, where countries who have entered into these kinds of agreements with each other would come together and say, for example, what are all the things we have in common as equivalency agreements? Enforceable standards, robust oversight, effective compliance and enforcement regimes that would have to be demonstrable, and how could we work then cooperatively to reduce costs on producers, to meet the standards of each of those individual things, to streamline our trade rules, to look at how we use, for example, tariff codes, where we have dedicated some of those to organic. Can our other partners do the same so we can track our trade flows and progress? And then increase leverage to make sure that those who sign up for this larger arrangement are actually meeting their commitments and maintaining a commitment to that robust program. So we're just beginning consultations with folks like all of you to say, what do you think about this? Can we take that sort of Venn diagram of all the different programs and see where they overlap and create a sort of a common core of commitment? And then think about how we recognize each other, recognizing that while our programs might provide equivalent levels of protection, they might not have all the same specific rules. So do we need deviations in some places? Do we need to think about product coverage? Are there places where it fits better than others? I think these are all things we're willing to consider. And so I just want to posit that idea a little bit with you now. But the WTO may be a good place to be able to discuss those standards and to think about those movements of goods. And if we can create a platform that, again, maintains the integrity and your ability to differentiate your goods as being organic and to have consumers know what that means, but reduce some of the red tape that it takes for you to access different markets. So I think it's an exciting time that we've seen so much interest in doing this, that people understand that organic is truly a global business. There's a desire and a need for products to move throughout the supply chain across borders, and look forward to working with you to continue that momentum in a way that works best for U.S. organic overall. And one of the other ways that we facilitate trade globally in agricultural products, but in other products as well, is of course through the formulation of international trade agreements. And in October of last year, we concluded the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is a comprehensive free trade agreement with 12 countries in the Asia-Pacific. It's a particularly interesting agreement for agriculture for a couple of reasons. One is that it's comprehensive in nature, which frankly is not always true. When you think about a trade agreement, the first thing that you do is you reduce or you eliminate the tariffs on products that move back and forth between countries. Both countries make that commitment. And while that's a great goal, in agriculture, a lot of these free trade agreements fall short of that, because agricultural products tend to be some of the most sensitive sectors that we have. And yet these TPP countries, these 12 countries, made a commitment to address every product without exception. So every tariff line, every agricultural product is liberalized in some way. And that's a big benefit to U.S. agriculture because frankly, our agricultural markets are already very open. We have relatively low tariffs on agricultural products. We have transparent procedures. When our tariffs are not very low, when we have quotas or other mechanisms, it's clear how they are used. We provide good, transparent access to them. That is not the case in much of the rest of the world, where we face very high barriers to trade. This agreement includes countries like Canada, who even in the NAFTA agreement did not provide access to their dairy, poultry, or egg sectors. New access for all dairy, poultry, and egg products is on the table in TPP. This agreement includes Japan, who has never before, in a free trade agreement, put all of its ag products on the table. It has its sacred agricultural sectors that it calls, that they've always said are exempt from any free trade agreement discussion. All of those are on the table, and every product is addressed in some way. That includes beef, pork, dairy, wheat, rice, and sugar, all of great interest to U.S. agriculture. And it includes new rules that are critically important for U.S. ag exports on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And a number of you make a great deal, you have the price all figured out, but then suddenly your product is stuck at the border for an animal or plant health issue, for a food safety issue, sometimes that is applied without prior notice, for a non-scientific reason, and in a non-transparent way. And so this agreement contains very strong language about ensuring a scientific basis for applying those measures, for doing so in ways that are transparent, for making rules in a way that provides notice and comment, a process we take for granted in the United States, but frankly isn't available in the rulemaking procedures in a number of other countries. So you'd have an opportunity to weigh in and say, have you thought of applying this rule in a new way? Have you thought about allowing a treatment or a mitigation measure that would allow my product to remain organic, but also address your pest problem? Those are the kinds of things that we've built into this agreement to encourage the faster movement of goods. Also looking at rapid notification if for some reason your product should fail an inspection, that you would be notified quickly of why that is and what you would have to do to remedy it. Particularly important if you have perishable and high-value agricultural products that, of course, are reduced in quality. Every day you wait for your product to make it across that border. So we think these are all critically important. And aside from covering every product, from creating new and important agricultural rules, we also have access to some critical and evolving countries that I think provide a great opportunity for U.S. agriculture generally, but also an opportunity to become the supplier of choice when those countries are starting to think a lot about the quality and the values behind their food, because their populations are starting to join the middle class. And that's in Vietnam and Malaysia in particular. These countries have rapidly growing populations, but the percentage of their population that's joining the middle class is also growing very quickly. And so what that means is they're now really good customers for our commodities. They buy our feed grains, our corn, our soybeans, our skim milk powder, and they're very good customers, and the volume of that product is growing. But when people join the middle class, the first thing they change with that income is the way that they eat. They demand more protein, an opportunity for us to export our meat, our poultry, our dairy products, our eggs. They demand fresh fruits and vegetables. They look across the board at the quality and the variety of the calories in their diet. And as folks join the middle class, they start to think about the source of the products that they eat. And what you're seeing in a lot of these developing countries is the demand we're seeing in this country, which is wanting information about where their food comes from. And so we have an opportunity by doing trade agreements with these countries as they develop to start to familiarize them with our products and with what our products stand for, including your organic products as well. And I think what we've envisioned from the TPP was that we took 12 countries who were ready right now to adopt really high standards on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, strong intellectual property protections. There are countries where we find U.S. peanuts or U.S. products that aren't from the U.S., but where they capitalize on our brand. We want to protect your brand, your symbols, protections to do so. And again, a high commitment to tariff elimination, but also then to take the benefits of that initial group who were willing to meet that high standard, show the benefits to the rest of the region, and then invite others to join. And I think it's important that we have Vietnam and Malaysia at the table at a very different level of development who have willingly signed on to these high standards. And when I think other countries in the region saw that, that they were able to meet them, that they saw those standards as being good for their eventual development and contributing to it, they've shown a lot of interest. So we concluded these negotiations on October 5th. By October 15th, 8 countries in the region had called my boss, Ambassador Froman, our trade representative, to say, when are you accepting new members? And that includes economies like Korea, that's in Taiwan, that's Indonesia, the Philippines, again, large population, growing middle class, excellent markets for US products. But we have to have the TPP in force before it can be that magnet for the region and before all of you can take advantage of the tariffs and reductions and the new access that it provides. So we are working with Congress and hoping to accomplish that and hoping it can be done in that lame duck session and educating folks about it. Again, it also contains for the first time an annex on organics that specifically looks toward ways that we might recognize each other's programs and reinforce them to encourage trade in the sector where you all participate. I would also note that you heard a little bit about how I grew up. And so environmental standards were a big deal and a big ethic in my house. And this agreement has the strongest environment and labor standards of any free trade agreement that has been passed. I think we're taking advantage of a particularly unique opportunity in the TPP to address environmental issues because we've zeroed in on specifically those issues where the environment and trade intersect. And so we've said, how can the economies in this region work together, for example, to combat illegal logging? Can we get our environmental officials and our trade officials to crack down on the fact that a lot of the ports that illegally harvested timber go through happen to be in this region where we're doing this trade agreement? Can we work together to reduce that so that, one, our forestry products don't have to unfairly compete with illicit product, but 2, that we reap the environmental benefit of cutting down on the incentive to illegally harvest wood. Same thing, this is the first agreement that outlaws fishery subsidies that have led to overharvesting, to illegal and unregulated fishing, cutting down on that in the region. Not only, again, do we not want legal products to have to compete unfairly with illicit products, but let's think about Southeast Asia and how many subsistence fishermen and women there are that depend on fisheries being healthy for their livelihoods. So we can use trade and environmental officials working together to create a real win-win for the environment and for the economies of all of our countries. And I know that's an issue that's important to many of you, so I raise it here. But we should also remember that this new access to markets that we want, one, it doesn't happen unless we advocate for it and make sure that our Congress brings it into force. But 2, other countries won't stop doing trade agreements with each other just because we don't get our act together and pass this agreement and move forward. In fact, other countries throughout the agreement or throughout the region are busy forming agreements with each other and bringing down their tariffs to each other and not waiting for us. The Japan, Australia, again, 2 countries that are part of TPP, but have done a bilateral trade agreement in the meantime that has gone into force and is now in their 3rd round of tariff cuts. And so a pound of beef from Australia now pays a 10% less tariff than a pound of beef from the United States going into Japan, our largest international customer for that product. And you see that across the board. The ASEAN countries already have a free trade agreement with each other. U.S. wine faces it's a huge opportunity in that region, but Australia and New Zealand can now export their wine to that region with 0 tariff. We still pay tariffs there. The same with dairy, with cheese. We pay a 10% tariff into Vietnam. New Zealand and Australia, our major competitors in the region, will be at 0 next year. So we lose ground while we wait. And the last thing I would point out is that, we're not the only ones with an idea of what the model for trade in the region should look like. We chose to set the highest standard that we could that reflects our values not only for free movement of goods, for that commitment to science and a high SPS standard, but also to high labor and environmental standards, and so this is what we think trade relationships should look like. But China has a separate model. It's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. A number of TPP countries are in it, but a number of additional countries like India are also part of the RCEP. And once we finished TPP, they said, you know what, let's accelerate our negotiations and try and beat them to the punch. We want to finish our agreement by the end of the year, and we want it to be the standard that everyone aligns to. But it does not have a commitment to comprehensive coverage of products. It does not have high labor and environmental standards. It does not have high standards for intellectual property protection. It will not surprise you that in TPP there is a commitment to a free and open internet. That does not exist in the RCEP. And so I think we have an opportunity to set standards that are frankly the way the US does business, that provide certainty to you in the marketplace through transparency and honoring of contracts and high protection for intellectual property, that we can spread to the region, but only if we become the model that others set themselves to. So we have an opportunity right now to do that through our leadership in the region through TPP, but it will take cooperation from many of you to get that done and to see it go into force. And so would be very pleased to work with you to make that happen, and we hope that's something that Congress will approve this year. So with that, I will finish and open it up for questions you might have on trade generally, equivalency agreements, or on the TPP, any trade issue you wish.
Hi, my name is Matthew. Sorry.
Where are you there?
So I live about a half hour away in Maryland and work at a retailer that sells a lot of organics. And some of our more popular items, like you could even say regional suppliers like poultry, we can't keep in stock because it's made to such a high standard that they can't keep up with the demand. Is there any impact or consideration of the impact of sending this stuff overseas while not being able to meet demand domestically?
Well, I certainly think that that's a decision for the producer, right? That obviously increasing demand, that's a good problem to have, I guess, if you're the poultry producer. One would expect that production, if there was a consistent demand, would increase. And would try to fill that demand. That if there, I remember the days when I was a little girl and my dad was trying to cobble together enough people who could demand organic to make that model work and be consistent, and to invest in the money it takes to get certified to be able to move your product. So hopefully what that means is that the demand will help encourage more consistent supply, and the investment that it takes, let's be honest, it takes an effort to get certified, to develop that supply chain for your feed and your products and other things and maintain the integrity of that product. Consistent and growing demand can help create the incentive to do that. But certainly there is competition for organic product. And again, hopefully if we can do some of the recognition of ingredients of organic programs back and forth, then the supply as well of the ingredients to get to finished product like your poultry, for example, would be easier as well. But I think in general, I realize it can create a short-term problem for you, meeting your consumer demand. But I think a growing interest in demand for organic is a good problem to have, and one I hope you all are poised to solve very, very soon. So.
Hi, Sam Zundias, New York University. Very excited about the organic annex that you're talking about in the TPP, and excited to support it. However, I'm having a little bit of difficulty reconciling it with some of the more troubling news we've heard inside of the TPP as far as protections for intellectual property in regards to biotech and pharmaceuticals. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to how we can kind of envision reconciling the goods with the bad there.
Well, I think that we have provided an appropriate level of protection and a carefully negotiated one that will allow a culture of innovation. I think that's a place where the U.S. excels, and that when you do research and you invest in that research, you want to see that protected for a period of time so that you are able to benefit from its effects. And the question there is, how do you get the appropriate balance, and how do you reconcile different countries? Length of time, conditions around that intellectual property protection, whether it be for pharmaceuticals or for copyright protection or what have you, that everyone can agree to, again, to make sure that those companies can operate with certainty across different products. And I think we've struck the appropriate balance that would allow for passage of that agreement in all of those countries. And these are tough issues, just as you When you talk about those agreements being troubling, I'm sure there are others on the other side who think they are troubling for the opposite reason. So we've tried again to strike that appropriate balance that will recognize and protect innovation while also encouraging others to enter that market and be able to participate.
Well, they certainly sent the right messenger to try to convey the message, and it's really hard for me to ask, hard questions because of the years that I've known you. But,
Yeah, that shouldn't make you back down.
you know,
My dad has no problem continuing to ask me hard questions. So.
you mentioned the environmental stuff. What about the social stuff? And what about what my perception because the negotiations were done in secret behind closed doors, and I haven't read the whole TPP and all that stuff. But the idea that if it's true, and you'll tell me whether it is or not, whether, for instance, biotech companies have the upper hand in the sense of going and destroying culture, the idea of saving seeds with our USAID tax dollars to go give seeds that then will get farmers onto the same chemical treadmill. What are we doing about that, about encouraging them to maintain their culture, and then about the labor stuff, which makes, competitively makes a difference in this country for exports.
Sure.
And imports.
Well, let me start by saying this is in fact a free trade agreement, and while it is broad and comprehensive, it does not change U.S., it doesn't speak to U.S. development policy per se. It does not set domestic policy in countries and tell them exactly what their agricultural development policy should be. And I don't think we want it to. We want a trade agreement to make sure that it addresses the ability for product to move back and forth, for it to be treated fairly and consistently and transparently, but we don't want actually the 11 other TPP countries to tell us exactly what our environmental standards should be. What we do want is in TPP to know that all countries have signed up to a certain minimum standard, so there's at least some sort of level playing field. So I got involved in trade agreements because I was convinced that somehow the international trading system was going to undermine all of our environmental standards and be at odds. What I found to be the case was in fact the opposite, which is why I then pursued a career as a trade negotiator. I was convinced I was going to go to the U.S. Trade Representative's office for 6 months and discover why the WTO was so evil, and then I could go out and work in an environmental NGO to defeat it. What I came out of there realizing is that globalization and trade will happen, and that they continue to happen and increase, and we can either try to create a rules-based system where we at least know and can enforce some standards of how that trade takes place, and through things like TPP elevate those standards over time as other countries are willing and understand that they should be balancing their trade policy with their environment policy and their labor policy, and work with those countries to elevate those standards rather than say it's a free-for-all in the marketplace. And so, I'll tell you a little story on the environment side. I started out negotiating the environmental provisions of trade agreements, and I did so for the first time in the Chile Free Trade Agreement. And what the Chileans said to us is, this isn't trade policy. You're trying to enforce your environment and your labor standards on us. You want to create some gotcha so that you can come back and punish us if we don't meet the same standards that you do, and then slap trade sanctions on us. So this is going to be a one-way trade agreement. We don't want to do this. Eventually we said, well, it does kind of matter. And your long-term development would be aided by the fact if you thought about the environmental impact of trade, if you had some certain labor standards and made sure that your facilities that were exporting also were enforcing your labor laws. That's a level playing field for us, but it's also better for you. And at the negotiating table were the trade negotiators. I was with USTR, but when we negotiate trade agreements in the US, all the other agencies that are involved are at the table. So if we're talking about SPS, we've got APHIS and FSIS next to us and FDA to make sure that we don't do anything that undermines our standards. So when we do the environmental chapter, obviously EPA and the Department of Interior and folks who look at our environmental laws are sitting at the table with us, and so is the environmental agency in Chile. And they were kind of frustrated that maybe they were going to be held to standards they didn't want to be. It was a difficult negotiation, but when it was all over, my colleague from the Environment Ministry in Chile pulled me aside and said, thank you for forcing me to do this. Because in every previous trade agreement that Chile has negotiated, we didn't know what was on the table. our environment ministry went off and did this in a different place. We couldn't think about which sectors. We didn't have the analysis, which sectors were likely to grow. In Chile, a country that has a lot of resources like mining and agriculture that are, resource intensive, they have a real bearing on the environment, he said, I can totally change the way I run my department so that I can anticipate where there will be opportunities and stresses, how the trade agreement will allow me to access new environmental technologies, and I can plan all of that because I have a sense of how commerce is going to move under these new rules. So there's a lot out there that says globalization and trade agreements are the same thing. I think of them as very different. That trade agreements are an opportunity for us to shape globalization and to create an incentive to trade more with countries who are willing to do more, who are willing to sign up to key labor standards to make sure that they provide a minimum wage and minimum standards for conditions at work, and to meet certain ILO standards that are out there. That's all in the TPP. So if we bring our tariffs down and they bring our tariffs down and we incentivize trade with countries who are willing to do that, that's okay by me. That's a way for us to vote with our dollars to try and put a little bit of structure around how we think trade should be conducted and how we think others should do business to be part of that club. So, I realize trade has become definitely the boogeyman of these last few months of what ails us economically. It's the fault of trade. We're sending our jobs one place or another. No doubt, globalization has put some pressure on certain sectors, and competing is not always the easiest as other countries specialize and participate in the global marketplace. But trade agreements are a way to be able to shape that and to recognize the values that we want to by creating standards that our trading partners have to meet.
Today, and I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to see you.